By the time I held the divorce papers in my trembling hands, the ink of his signature still fresh, I already knew the truth. My life had ended weeks earlier. It ended in a kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and scrambled eggs. That morning, my husband looked at me with rehearsed calm and told me his mistress was pregnant. Everything that followed was just the echo of that moment. And this is where my story begins.
This isn't just a story, it's a confession whispered into the dark. If you leave your mark or comment, I'll likely it shows the Redditor-X-Tales family you were really here listening. And when you subscribe and tap the bell, you're not just supporting this channel, you're helping this story find someone who truly needs it. We at Redditor-X-Tales are grateful you're here.
My name is Claire Mitchell. I'm 34 years old, a former college literature professor. For years, I was known among colleagues for my essays on contemporary poetry. Once my dream of having a family came true, I stepped back from my academic career. My husband, Daniel Mitchell, a corporate lawyer, is 2 years older than me. We met in college, married after 4 years together. 7 years of marriage, it felt like we had built something solid, something real. And here's my story. That morning began like any other. The smell of fresh coffee and scrambled eggs filled our 21st floor apartment. Beyond the window stretched Chicago glass towers reflecting the rising sun, tiny figures rushing to work far below. I stood at the stove, cooking breakfast, while Daniel settled at the table with that relaxed ease that used to melt me. My husband complimented the meal, just as he had every morning for years. He said I really made the best breakfasts in the city, that everything I cooked turned out perfect. I smiled faintly and murmured something about being glad he enjoyed it. Those little rituals had become so routine that I never even thought about them. Then Daniel casually asked me to take out his gray suit for a week-long trip to Milwaukee. He explained it would spare him stress if everything was ready ahead of time. I nodded without hesitation. Our life ran on such a smooth rhythm that these requests felt natural. Everything looked deceptively normal until my husband set down his fork, dabbed his mouth with exaggerated calm, and looked at me with eyes that felt rehearsed. The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken. My heart raced as if it already sensed disaster. Daniel spoke gently, almost apologetically. His tone had the same artificial delicacy doctors use when delivering bad news. Then came the words that knocked the ground out from under me. He admitted her name was Sophie. He was in love with her. And she was pregnant. The words crashed into the silence like a thunderclap. My breath stopped, my ears roared, my stomach twisted into a knot. For a moment, I thought I had misheard, that my pulse had drowned out his voice and warped its meaning. But Daniel kept explaining, insisting it wasn't my fault, that feeling simply fade. His calmness clashed with the storm breaking inside me. He went on, detached, reasoning about Sophie's pregnancy and his responsibility. Daniel believed children deserved a complete family, an obligation he couldn't abandon. He wanted to be there, to give that baby the life it deserved. Each of his words fell on me like drops of icy water. He even reached across the table, touched my hand, a gesture that once meant closeness, now a cruel mockery. He hoped we could remain friends because hostility, he said, poisons the soul. I stared at his face, trying to grasp how he could calmly dismantle our marriage with those words. My silence he took as acceptance, and launched into a lecture about how I would process this in stages. Daniel spoke of grief cycles like he was quoting a psychology textbook, of first anger, then bargaining, then sadness, and finally acceptance. My fingers went numb from how tightly I was clenching them under the table, my neck muscles straining until they ached. Finally, his tone turned businesslike and cold. Daniel told me he'd be away for a week, and by the time he returned, I needed to pack my things and leave the apartment. 1 week, he calculated, would be plenty. He was certain I would come to terms with it. Very soon, new voices would fill this home, Sophie's. His pregnant mistress would move in, and they would have their child. Daniel stood, rinsed his plate, checked his phone, and smiled at a message surely from her, the woman who had shattered my marriage. Then, with chilling nonchalance, he kissed the top of my head and headed out the door. I remained frozen in my chair, paralyzed by shock, too stunned to plead or protest. The apartment that, just an hour earlier, I thought of as our shared home suddenly felt foreign. That apartment had been my pride. I had chosen every piece of furniture myself, save for each item. Every corner held proof of how much effort I had poured into creating a family home. Now every object marked me, none of it would stay mine. It would belong to Sophie and the child Daniel had chosen over our marriage. The humiliation of yielding my place to another woman was unbearable. For a moment, I was consumed by violent fantasies, toppling the tall bookshelf, tearing pages apart, scattering photographs, splitting the dining table in two, smashing plates against the walls. The urge to destroy was intoxicating, a desperate way to reclaim control. But I sank onto the couch, realizing chaos would only deepen my pain and give Daniel the excuse to brand me unstable. I whispered to myself, "Don't hand him that card." I stood up, slipped on my shoes. I needed air before I suffocated. I left the building. Outside, life went on. I walked to the park, the place that had always offered me quiet space for thought, and sat on a bench under a maple tree. I watched a jogger, a man tossing a ball for his dog, and envied their normalcy, their stability. I wondered if I had been blind to the signs of Daniel's betrayal. One thing I knew for certain, my husband had cheated, and in a week Sophie would take my place. What I didn't know then was that this betrayal was only the beginning of a story that would change me forever. That evening, after wandering aimlessly through the park, I returned home and froze in the hallway. The keys shook in my hand, my chest tightening at the thought of stepping into a wall soaked with lies. Every object inside had turned into a witness to my humiliation, on the couch where we once watched movies, the bed where only yesterday we lay side by side, the kitchen table where, that very morning, my life collapsed. I couldn't turn the key. Behind me, a familiar voice reminded me of how broken I must have looked. It was my 72-year-old neighbor, Evelyn Harper. For more than 2 decades she had lived across the hall, a woman Daniel and I often met in the elevator or corridor. Always polite, never intrusive. Yet now her grey-blue eyes held such warmth that I almost cried. She invited me inside for tea, and I accepted. Her apartment was the opposite of my sleek, modern place. It carried the atmosphere of old America, knitted throws on the couch, framed family photographs on every shelf, the scent of chamomile and lavender filling the air. Porcelain figurines lined the shelves, each carrying years of quiet devotion. She sat me in a soft chair and placed a cup of tea in front of me. Her silence was stronger than words. I could no longer keep it inside. The memory poured out of me the morning that had destroyed my life. Daniel's confession about the other woman. The knowledge that she was pregnant. The realization that, in his eyes, I was already erased, given only 1 week before I was to vanish from his home. I told Evelyn everything, because if I hadn't, it would have torn me apart from within. My voice shook, my hands trembled so badly I had to set down the cup. Evelyn reached out, covered my hand with hers. Her touch was warm and steady, grounding me. She reminded me that no one deserves betrayal, least of all served with such icy detachment. I tortured myself with questions. Had I missed the obvious signs? Had the fault been mine for not working harder to preserve my marriage? Doubt gnawed at me, turning grief into self-blame. But Evelyn, with the certainty of someone who had lived through it, told me it wasn't my fault. She knew it too well, because in her youth she had chosen to forgive her own husband's betrayal. She had even raised his child from another woman, believing it was noble. Years later, he left her anyway, when the boy turned 15. Her voice grew firm, carrying all the bitterness of a lifetime, and the wisdom paid for it too high a cost. A man who betrays once will do it again. He would drain me of peace and hope until nothing remained. Broken glass can still shine, she told me. But I must never let the one who shattered me gather the pieces on his terms. I returned to my apartment with my soul steadier than it had been all day. For the first time since the morning, I didn't feel entirely broken. The next day brought reality in its most official form. In the mailbox lay an envelope stamped with the seal of the Cook County Circuit Court. Inside were divorce papers, Daniel Mitchell versus Claire Mitchell. He had wasted no time. While I was still reeling from yesterday's blow, he had already moved forward. The legal language was cold and methodical, a division of property, notice to vacate, his signature at the bottom. The humiliation was complete. Reality pressed down on me. This wasn't a nightmare to wake from. It was my new life, where I had no choice but to start over or drown. With trembling fingers, I called my mother. Margaret answered on the second ring, and I spilled everything in Daniel's confession, the pregnancy, the divorce papers. My words tumbled out uncontrollably, like grains pouring from a torn sack. She told me she was coming immediately, and when I asked if I could move in with her, she reminded me that her house had always been mine. Within an hour, 2 cars arrived. My brother Thomas came with his wife Emily and their young son Noah. Thomas, 32 and an architect, said nothing, but the anger in his face told me enough. Emily, a pediatrician, hugged me gently. 6-year-old Noah had no idea of the storm that had broken over the adult world. Soon after, my mother arrived with boxes and packing tape. At 58, a high school history teacher, she knew how to act quickly in a crisis. She ordered me to take everything that was mine, leave nothing behind. We packed in silence, each of them stripping pieces of my life from that place. Thomas carefully boxed my books, Emily folded my clothes, my mother wrapped the dishes we had once received as wedding gifts. Whenever I clung to an object too long, Thomas gently took it from my hands and hugged me. Their quiet support meant more than words. By evening, the apartment had become a hollow shell. I felt no urge to say goodbye, let Daniel build his new life there with Sophie. My mother put her arm around me and whispered that I was stronger than I thought, and that starting over with family beside me was a gift. Our calm departure was interrupted by heavy steps in the corridor and the sound of a key in the lock. It was Patricia, my 60-year-old mother-in-law, her expression hard, her eyes full of condemnation. She had always been a woman used to control. She accused me of theft, threatened to call the police. My mother stood at my side. My brother stepped forward like a shield. He explained calmly that I was only taking what was mine, nothing more. But Patricia insisted everything belonged to her son. In her view, I should have been grateful for the years I had lived there. My mother defended me with the fierce certainty only a mother can have when her child is under attack. She reminded Patricia that I had given 7 years of my life to Daniel, and that I had every right to take what belonged to me. I forced myself to stand tall, to meet Patricia's eyes. I told myself and her that I would not leave empty-handed, as if I had never lived there. Daniel had destroyed the marriage on his own. No one else needed to. Thomas laid the last set of keys firmly on the kitchen counter. The slam of the door behind me sounded like the end of an entire chapter of my life. Relief washed through me as if a heavy knot had finally loosened. I didn't yet know that a long winter of loneliness lay ahead, but it would also mark the beginning of my path to a new life. 6 months later, I sat at a small table by the window of my rented apartment, watching the morning light slide across the open pages of a book. Steam rose from a cup of coffee I had finally learned to brew exactly the way I liked it, strong, with a hint of cinnamon, without adjusting to anyone else's tastes. That simple ritual had become a symbol of my new life. Every morning I made a choice in favor of myself. My 1-bedroom apartment had turned into the refuge I never had in marriage. The shelves filled with books on literature that once gathered dust in boxes, dismissed by Daniel as useless clutter. Small plants thrived on the windowsill, nurtured with the same tenderness I had once poured into a dying relationship. This time, the care bore fruit. Work at the local cultural center was entirely different from teaching in a college, but it was exactly what my wounded soul needed. I hosted literary evenings for adults, helping them find words for their stories. In their eyes, I saw the same pain I had once endured, and I understood that betrayal had given me something valuable, the ability to heal others through the art of words. One evening, After a particularly moving session where an elderly woman read poems about the loss of her husband, a man approached me. His name was Michael Clarkson, a 41-year-old cardiologist who had recently moved to Chicago. In his dark eyes I recognized the same cautious hope I had seen in my own fiction. He told me he had been attending our gatherings for a month, that the words spoken there helped him cope with his own divorce. His wife had left him for his best friend, taking their 10-year-old daughter to another state. The ache in his voice resonated in my chest. I knew that melody of Betrayal by heart. We began meeting after the sessions, first just walking along the Chicago waterfront, then moving to long conversations in cafes. Michael never rushed things, never tried to heal my wounds with his care. Instead, he was simply there when I needed silence and spoke when I was ready to listen. With him, I felt equal for the first time in years. He admired my knowledge of literature, asked for advice on books that might help his daughter through her parents' divorce. In his gaze, there was no attempt to reshape me to fit someone's standards, only sincere acceptance of who I was. 3 more months passed before we dared our first kiss. We stood on a bridge over the river, watching the city light shimmer in the water, talking about the future. When his lips touched mine, I felt not passion, but something deeper, peace. The peace of someone who had finally found a home in the arms of a person who understood the value of trust. Eventually, Michael asked me to move into his spacious apartment on the north side of the city. I declined, not out of distrust, but because I knew I needed more time to fully recover. He wasn't offended. He didn't insist. He only told me he would wait as long as it took. That spring, I received a letter from a lawyer. Daniel had filed for bankruptcy. His law firm had collapsed after a series of failed deals, and Sophie had left him soon after giving birth. Patricia, my former mother-in-law, wrote me separately her letter full of reproaches and pleas to help her son. Reading those lines, I felt neither triumph nor pity. Only a quiet sorrow for the wasted years and gratitude that I had left in time. Daniel had received what his choices deserved, and I had gained what I never dared to dream of, the freedom to be myself. That same day, I met Evelyn Harper in our favorite cafe. When I told her about Michael, about my work, about my plans to write a book based on my experience, her eyes glistened with tears of joy. Her words confirmed what I had already begun to feel, that even shattered glass can shine brighter than something whole, that I had found my own light in the darkness. Her words rested on my heart like balm. I realized that the journey from betrayal to healing had not been in vain. Every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of despair had brought me to this point where I could sit in a cafe with someone who had taught me not to fear, trust, and plan a future that belonged only to me. That evening, Michael came to me with a bouquet of wildflowers and an invitation that made my heart pause. It wasn't a proposal of marriage, we both knew it was too soon for that. It was an invitation to spend time together in a small mountain town in Colorado, a place where I could ride on a porch overlooking snow-capped peaks. I said yes without hesitation. Not because I feared being alone, not to please him, but because I had finally learned to make choices rooted in joy, not in fear. Now, as I write these lines, the first snow of winter drifts past my window. The flakes spin slowly in the glow of the streetlights, reminding me that even the harshest seasons give way to new beauty. My journey from betrayed wife to independent woman had been hard, but it was worth it. Daniel had given me the greatest gift without knowing it. He had freed me from the illusion that I needed to become someone else to earn love. I now knew that true love demands no sacrifice, only honesty. It requires no perfection, only sincerity. It doesn't mean losing yourself, only being willing to grow together. The story of my betrayal had ended in a courtroom 9 months ago. The story of my rebirth began the moment I finally looked in the mirror and smiled at the woman I saw there. And for the first time, I could tell myself I like her. Imperfect but real. That is our strength. I like her story, even its darkest pages, because they brought her here to a place of light, hope, and endless possibility.
Hey. That's it, today's story comes to an end. And honestly, thank you from the heart of the Redditor-X-Tales family for staying with us until the very last word. We at Redditor-X-Tales love to know what you think really. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read them all. And trust me, your words mean more than you realize. If you're hungry for more, the full playlist is waiting in the description. And don't worry, new true stories are already on the way. The Redditor-X-Tales family can't wait to share them with you. If this journey touched you even a little, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you'll never miss the next story. Once again, thank you for listening. Until next time, take care.